I think I've developed a little bit of a cough from the dust, so bear with me if I have to take a moment. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So today we're going to discuss some of the basics about cold brew, what cold brew is, what cold brew isn't. We're going to talk about some of the ways in which cold brew has become a trend that is really impacting the global coffee market. And we're going to discuss the risks and opportunities of cold brew. And finally, we are going to take some time for your questions. And I mention that because every time I talk about cold brew in conversation, people say, oh, I'm so glad you're here. I have some questions for you. So I invite you to write down some of your questions. We'll have some time at the end, and I will also be happy to discuss further after the presentation today. And for any of you who are on the field trip tomorrow, I'll be on the bus. So I come to coffee from a varied background. I've been on the marketing side, the sales side, the purchasing side. I've been a barista back when I was in high school, and I've dabbled in a little bit of roasting. Don't recommend you drink any of the coffee I roasted, but I know just enough to be conversational about it. But here's a little secret. I actually didn't really like coffee all that much for most of my life. Sure, I liked the way coffee smelled, but the taste just never seemed to compare. So I would drink it, usually heavily laden with cream and sugar and other flavorings. My favorite for years and years was hazelnut. And this was really my perspective on coffee until I became more active in the coffee industry. I didn't recognize or appreciate the difference between quality coffee and mediocre coffee. Two things changed this perception for me, however. First was my first taste of cold brewed coffee, and second was my first trip to Origin. Now I'll get back to these experiences in a few minutes. Let's talk about cold brew itself. Cold brew is not new. The origin of cold brew has been debated almost as much as the origin of coffee. As cold brew is exploding as a trend across the world, many people do not realize that the brewing method has been around for centuries. Some of you may have actually grown up with cold brew in your home. My company, Toddy, actually got its start in Peru. The inventor of the Toddy cold brew system, Todd Simpson, took a trip to Peru in the early 1960s with his wife, Betty. While there, they stopped at a small restaurant, and they were served cold brewed coffee as a concentrate with a pot of hot water. They were invited to dilute it to the flavor intensity of their preference. So Todd tasted this coffee, and he was really surprised. He was tasting a sweetness, a smoothness that he never really encountered before in coffee. Now Betty, his wife, also tasted the coffee, and she noticed a couple of hours later that she didn't have the stomach pain that she normally experienced when drinking coffee. The couple was intrigued. They brought this concept back to the United States, and in 1964, they started selling the very first Toddy coffee makers. Cold brew coffee was almost always served hot, and that is until quite recently. So what exactly is cold brew? Cold brew is a brewing method that replaces heat with time. Let me say that again. Cold brew is a brewing method that replaces heat with time. So instead of running steaming hot water quickly over your coffee grounds, like you do with most traditional brewing methods, with cold water, you steep your coffee grounds with cool water for an extended period of time, anywhere from 8 to 24 hours. The key to cold brew is time. With this brewing method, you extract a different chemical composition from the coffee beans than you do with hot water brewing. Cold water brewing, therefore, creates characteristics that are different flavor profiles, different pH, different length of time for freshness, the list goes on. So you may still be thinking about my earlier comment about how cold brew was served hot for most of its life until recently. Now why is that? So I go back to the concept of brewing a concentrate. With cold brew, you're typically brewing a concentrated coffee, stronger than you would drink by itself. So you can serve cold brew hot by diluting it with hot water. You can serve it as an iced coffee by diluting it with water and ice. You can also serve it in a variety of other ways. Cold brew is ripe for experimentation in many ways. In its concentrated form, cold brew is also a very popular ingredient for a variety of different beverages and food items. We work with clients who utilize cold brew as an ingredient for things such as cocktails, barbecue sauces, baked goods, ice creams, etc. It's very versatile. So I want to talk a little bit about what cold brew is not. So iced coffee can be made with cold brew, but not all iced coffee is cold brew. And I think there's a lot of confusion even amongst the areas like the US where cold brew is growing so rapidly. Iced coffee and cold brew have become somewhat interchangeable in terms. So iced coffee, as I mentioned, can be made with cold brew. In these two instances here, you have an iced espresso in the photo on the left, and then the photo on the right is brewed coffee or French press coffee poured over ice. Again, these are both iced coffees, but they're not cold brew. The reason why this is important is because the chemical composition of coffee brewed with cold water is different than that brewed with hot water. So what is that difference exactly? Cold water brewing leaves the heat-soluble compounds in the coffee bean, and what is extracted are the water-soluble compounds. Coffee brewed with hot water only tastes fresh for a short period of time. I love drinking espresso, but I know if I have a shot of freshly brewed espresso, if I put it on the counter and walk away for 10 minutes, it's not going to be nearly as wonderful as if I drink it right away. With cold brew, that's different. Cold brew does not pull out the bitter acids and oils that quickly go stale with hot coffee, and therefore it can stay fresh for a significantly longer period of time. The difference in flavor profile can also be quite significant. People often use terms like smooth or sweet to describe coffee brewed with cold water because many of the bitter compounds are simply not extracted. Just like with any other brewing method, however, pairing the right coffee with the brewing method can really enhance the tasting experience. So let's talk about acidity a little bit. In the coffee industry, we often think of acidity in terms of brightness or what we're tasting in the cup. A term like low acid can actually be harmful to the score of a cup on the cupping form. Others, like Betty Simpson, think of acidity in terms of pH or what causes stomach upset when they drink coffee. A term like low acid can mean the difference between an enjoyable evening and one that is actually filled with physical discomfort from drinking coffee. Coffee brewed cold is significantly less acidic in terms of pH when compared to its hot brewed counterpart. That doesn't necessarily translate into lack of brightness, however. It depends on the coffee bean itself. Now, I had the privilege of cupping 5 coffees from the Cup of Excellence program in preparation for this presentation. And after this presentation, you'll also have an opportunity to taste 3 of them that I selected to really represent some different flavor components from cold brewing. Now, what immediately struck me about these coffees was how bright they were. The fruit notes, One even had some tomato-like acidity, just really exploded from the cup. I love tasting very high-quality coffees cold brewed because you never really know what you're going to get. I tasted the same coffees brewed hot. I admit I asked for a little bit more than I needed for my test so that I can enjoy them at home, and they were also wonderful. But the bright notes, the acidity was actually a little bit more muted when brewed hot. So why is that? This is one of my very favorite aspects about cold brewing. Cold water brewing extracts very different flavor profiles out of the coffee bean. Coffee brewed hot often smells sweeter than it actually is because, again, the bitter compounds can easily overpower the more delicate, the more nuanced, the more floral, etc. flavor components. When you leave the bitter compounds in the coffee bean, those delicate flavor components can really shine through. 15 years ago, when I tried cold brew for the first time, that was when I experienced coffee tasting the way it smelled for the first time. And again, I was not a coffee drinker, but that was the first day I really enjoyed a cup of black coffee. Yes, it was specialty coffee, but it wasn't necessarily a coffee that was very high-end or cup of excellence. It was a coffee that my friend gave me, recommended, I try it, I cold brewed it, I loved it. And really, overnight, I became a different kind of coffee consumer. I began purchasing whole bean coffee to brew at home. So what is all this buzz about cold brew? Depending on where you are in the world, cold brew is either an emerging concept or a flat-out craze. Starbucks just introduced its very first cold holiday beverage on the heels of its successful cold brew program. As Coleman Cuff mentioned yesterday, Starbucks sees cold coffee as a multi-billion-dollar segment. Now, Dunkin' Donuts has been cited as saying their recently launched cold brew program has been their most successful product launch in 16 years. Brands all over the world are starting to announce planned launches for cold brew programs. The US-based National Coffee Association's 2016 National Coffee Drinking Trends study found that 15% of US coffee drinkers in 2015 tried cold brew. As Andres Padilla mentioned yesterday, Rabobank is expecting that number to hit 30% in 2016, and our own independent research absolutely verifies this growth. So let's talk a little bit about ready-to-drink or bottled cold brews. Nearly every day, it seems, another brand is releasing a cold brewed, ready-to-drink beverage. This image reflects just a small sampling of what has recently been released in the US market. I could spend a whole hour discussing this trend in more detail, but I wanted to share a quick recap of why I believe cold brew has become such a huge phenomenon. First, as I mentioned, cold brew stays fresh longer. When brewed in a home or cafe setting, cold brews can stay fresh refrigerated for up to 2 weeks without deteriorating in flavor quality. When produced under commercial conditions, this freshness window can jump to 3 months or more. Again, picture your espresso that you put on the counter and walk away. You get maybe 5-10 minutes. Cold brew, we're talking about 3+ months. This is significant in terms of its versatility and in terms of what it can offer for coffee shops, beverage developers, etc. Bottling cold brew allows brands to enter into new markets. A coffee roaster, for example, can brew and bottle their own cold brew and serve it to their customers to increase brand loyalty. They can take it home, they can drink it at work, at school, etc. The same coffee roaster can now sell this bottled cold brewed beverage to grocery stores, to convenience stores, and reach a whole new market than they ever had access to. The non-bitter flavor profile of cold brew is winning over a new group of consumers. Just like I was 15 years ago, cold brew can really become a gateway into specialty coffee because it oftentimes can taste the way it smells. For people who don't enjoy the bitter nuances of coffee, cold brew is a way to experience specialty coffee on a whole new level. The flavor profile of many cold brew coffees is very approachable. Many studies have referenced how cold brew coffee is being consumed throughout the day and evening. People are going to coffee shops or buying it for home consumption in the morning, in the afternoon, and even extending into the evening hours. This is significant as a revenue stream for cafes. And yes, I will also talk about millennials. Alternative serving methods are attracting younger consumers. But at the same time, the very popular, at least in the US, nitro-pulled cold brew, which is essentially coffee that is served like beer, can be enjoyed by 20-something millennials and their parents alike. A lot of coffee brands who are introducing cold brew programs have been using terms like hip and in vogue to describe their cold brew programs with a lot of excitement. Cold brew presents new ways for differentiation. Now, even as more and more companies are launching cold brew programs, there's certainly not a one-size-fits-all approach. A cold brew program is like a blank canvas for these companies. They can utilize this brewing method to create something that is unique to them, attracting new customers and building brand loyalty. And let's take Starbucks, for example. About a year and a half ago, they launched their first cold brew program. They reinvigorated that program this fall by introducing a single origin Colombian, and pardon my accent, Nariño 70 as the basis of their cold brew program. And just a few weeks ago, they relaunched a holiday beverage using the base Nariño 70 as their cold brew, but adding a wonderful blend of mulling spices infused cream as their holiday drink. So even though they have a cold brew program that's been running for a while now, they keep reinvigorating it and getting new press, getting new hype, and building upon that brand loyalty. So I want to talk about risk. As an industry, we're facing incredible risks with cold brew if we get carried away too quickly, if we do not pay close enough attention. The most pressing risk is food safety. Now, food safety isn't really a big consideration for much of the coffee industry. Coffee is usually brewed at very high temperatures after being roasted at very high temperatures and served immediately. Any ready-to-drink beverage was designed and packaged for shelf stability. Cold brew is very different, and the food safety considerations are significantly more critical at all levels. Companies that do not pay close attention to these food safety considerations are putting themselves and their customers at risk. We also face the risk of the trend collapsing. If the industry only focuses on the hype of cold brew, consumers may eventually grow tired of it and move on to the next trend. But I think the biggest risk of cold brew segment, of cold brew as a segment overall, is failing to recognize the true opportunity that it presents us. I took my first trip to Origin in 2011, and even though I had been in the industry for several years by this time, I admit that coffee was still mostly a commodity to me. Although I understood that not all coffee was the same, I did not truly understand what made coffee unique from one another. One of the farms I had visited on this trip was quite small, and they did their own processing. I had the opportunity to see coffee plants for the first time, smell the blossoms, and pick a few cherries with the farmer herself. I then saw how she dried her natural processed coffee on raised beds, and we discussed the different processing method for her different varietals. And because she knew my passion for cold brew coffee, she had taken the time to cold brew several coffees and serve them to me, side by side with the same coffees brewed hot. This was the first time I tasted the same coffee brewed cold and hot side by side, and I was blown away. The fruity notes, the delicate notes of her natural process coffee just exploded from the cup. They were much more muted in the cup that was brewed hot. We tried a few other coffees like this, and it was striking how significant of an impact the brewing method made on the flavor profiles of the cups. I learned firsthand how the cold brew process could reveal characteristics about the coffee beans that were otherwise hidden, especially to somebody like me who was not a formally trained taster. Characteristics about varietal, microclimate, careful crop tending, processing method, and roast. The biggest opportunity I see with cold brew is the opportunity to enhance how we experience and share coffees with one another. Now, many people know that they like coffee, but they don't necessarily know why. I had an opportunity to visit with a delegate yesterday as we were standing in line near the espresso bar, and I was remarking to my colleague about how the citrusy notes were really coming out of the cup, and that was not what I had expected in the espresso. He pulled me aside and he said, "You must be a coffee taster. How do you know that this coffee tastes like oranges?" And I said, "Well, I've tasted a lot of coffees, but I really enjoy experiencing the different flavors, and I'm often surprised." And I think this experience was really interesting for me because it reiterated how people like me all over the country, all over the world, really don't know what it is that makes coffee nuanced. Cold brew need not be relegated to the summer drink menu of coffee shops. A cold brew program can, and dare I say should, be developed for companies at all levels of the coffee supply chain. My team is actually working hard to develop a cupping methodology for cold brew. This methodology will allow companies at various levels to experience the difference in these flavor profiles of cold brewed coffee right next to their hot brewed counterparts. We want to capture this experience in a way that is convenient for producers, importers, and buyers alike, not just for beverage developers. This will allow coffee buyers to better predict the taste of the cup much earlier in the process. For producers and importers, an understanding of their cold brew flavor profiles can have a huge impact on their ability to market to this growing segment. Many cold brew recipes utilize a much higher coffee to water ratio than hot brewing recipes. This translates into higher sales of green coffee. Identifying the right coffees for these recipes early on can reduce program development times and provide increased sales sooner, again, to all levels of the coffee supply chain. Cold brew can amplify flavors in a way that untrained tasters, like my friend I met yesterday, can easily identify and actually take home. We need to be focusing on quality and the exploration of how cold water brewing can enhance our coffee tasting experience. Let's utilize cold brew as a continuation of how we tell the stories of coffee and offer our customers an extraordinary experience. And I'd love to hear any of your questions. Thank you. Like I said, I'll be here the rest of the day and tomorrow on the field trip. Feel free to grab me and pull me aside.